Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, asking the question, what really controls the climate? 90 years ago, the New York Times wrote this: "Hottest summer in 4,000 years" may be the headline of a meteorological report of the future. Already, scientists are able to throw light on past climates and the correspondence of weather with fluctuations in the sun's heat. That there is some relation between sunspots and our weather has long been suspected by meteorologists. Now they're certain. So in 1931, the New York Times and the climate science community understood that the sun controlled the Earth's climate. And in 1975, National Geographic quoted the National Academy of Sciences: "The climates of the Earth have always been changing, and they will doubtless continue to do so in the future." In other words, climate change was occurring billions of years before humans graced this planet. But now the press and their chosen experts say that humans control the climate by burning fossil fuels. This superstition is largely due to a misinterpretation of Antarctic ice core graphs. The graphs show that temperature and carbon dioxide have tracked each other pretty closely for most of the last 450,000 years. Carbon dioxide has taken swings of about 100 parts per million, while temperatures in Antarctica have varied by about 10 degrees Celsius. No serious scientist would believe that a 100 part per million change in carbon dioxide could produce a 10°C swing in temperature. That interpretation would imply a climate sensitivity which is orders of magnitude higher than even the most ridiculous climate models. But Al Gore is not a scientist. He misinterpreted this graph, made a science fiction movie, and won the Nobel Prize for doing exactly that. This graph shows 4 different ice age cycles. Note that ice ages begin right when carbon dioxide is at its peak, and ice ages end right when carbon dioxide is at its lowest level. If you believe that carbon dioxide controls the climate, this is the exact opposite relationship of what you'd expect. What's actually going on here, and what every serious scientist has understood for over 100 years, is that temperature controls carbon dioxide, not the other way around. This is easy to explain to anyone who's ever opened up a warm beer. If you open up a warm beer, a lot of carbon dioxide foam fizzes out the top of the bottle. This is because the solubility of carbon dioxide in warm water is lower than it is in cold water. So when the oceans warm up, they outgas carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And when the oceans cool down, the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. This is one of the first things which geology students like myself were taught in college. It's very fundamental physics which the climate science community either chooses to ignore or does not understand. They are putting the cart before the horse. They say that carbon dioxide controls the temperature, when in fact the relationship is the exact opposite. Upton Sinclair said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." This statement has never been more true than with climate scientists. Now let's fast forward to BBC News this week. Great to speak to Michael Mann, telling it like it is. Climate change is real. It's happening. The heatwaves tell us as much. On BBC World, it's a sort of event you expect to see once in your lifetime if you're not a Methuselah. 1 in 2,000 year event. So he's saying that the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest at the end of June, which didn't break a single state record, is a 1 in 2,000 year event. Reminds me of this article from the New York Times in 1931. Hottest summer in 4,000 years. Except that in 1931, the New York Times understood that the climate was controlled by the sun. Now let's take a look at what actually happened with the heat wave at the end of June. ABC News reported, Pacific Northwest braces for historic heat wave, and experts say climate change could be to blame. In 1975, scientists understood that the Earth's climate is always changing. But the press has changed the term climate change into a noun, which represents some sort of Frankenstein's monster which was just created recently by human beings. The heat at the end of June in the Pacific Northwest was created largely by downslope winds, which warm up as they move to lower elevations. Kennewick, Washington was right in the middle of the heat wave. Temperatures in Kennewick got all the way up to 114 degrees, which is almost as hot as Kennewick got in 1898 and in 1939 when they reached 115 degrees. I'm thinking that 1939 was less than 2,000 years ago, but my math is a little bit different from that of Michael Mann. 1939 was a very hot year around the world. Adelaide, Melbourne, and Canberra all set their all-time temperature record that year. Also in 1939, massive forest fires in Victoria burned up most of the forest in that state. The fires were so bad that koalas almost went extinct. There were only 600 koalas left in the entire state of Victoria by 1940. So rather than talking about Michael Mann's junk science and lies, let's take a look at what actually happened in that heat wave. Over the past month, there's been a series of massive solar storms, the largest ones in years. These storms send out charged particles which interact with the Earth's atmosphere and do a lot of damage to communications. These solar storms also have a very significant effect on Earth's weather, as the New York Times understood in 1931. Now let's go back to the summer of 1859, when the Earth experienced the largest solar storm ever recorded. The northern and southern lights lit up the entire Earth all the way to the equator. The light was so bright that the lamplighters seriously contemplated extinguishing the street lamps. All electronic communication ceased because the telegraph lines were so full of electricity that the operators couldn't even touch the keypad. There was a severe disruption in communications, but nothing like what would happen if we had a similar storm now. Our infrastructure would be largely destroyed. The massive solar storm during the summer of 1859 was coincident with some rather remarkable weather as well. On June 17, 1859, normally cool Santa Barbara, California, heated up to 133 degrees for a few hours. That was a world's record temperature until California reached 134 degrees in 1913, a record which still stands. It was a very short-lived event, but just a few hours of the hot winds was enough to kill cattle and cause birds to drop lifeless from the trees. At 1 o'clock on June 17th, a burning wind came upon us. At 2 o'clock, the thermometer heated up to 133 degrees Fahrenheit. At 5 o'clock, it had fallen to 122 degrees, and at 7 o'clock, it stood at 77 degrees where it had been in the morning. The greatest losses were among the vegetables. The fruit trees are all burned. The pears and apples have been literally cooked. The atmosphere became so intensely heated that no human being could withstand its force. All sought their dwellings and had to shut doors and windows and remain for hours confined to their dwellings. The effects of such intense and unparalleled heat was demonstrated by the death of calves, rabbits, etc. The trees were all blasted, and the fruit, such as pears and apples, literally roasted on the trees as they fell to the ground. Fruit roasting on the trees in just a few hours is a pretty good indicator of how hot these downslope winds were in 1859. It's been understood for a very long time that the sun controls Earth's climate, and even the New York Times understood it 90 years ago. These giant solar storms, like the ones this summer and the much larger one in 1859, erupt from sunspots on the sun's surface. But now the New York Times is about propaganda, not news. They tweeted yesterday, "The number of extremely hot days is rising around the world. See how your hometown has changed since birth and how much hotter it may get." But the reality is that the frequency of hot days in the United States has plummeted over the past century, and they peaked in 1936. And not only has the frequency of hot weather declined, but so has the extent of it. In 1931, when that first New York Times article was written, 93% of the United States reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius sometime during the year. During the 1930s, close to 90% of the country was typically over 95 degrees sometime during the year, but now that number is much lower and was lowest on record in 2014. The heat Americans have experienced recently is nothing like the incredible heat of the 1930s. During the 1930s, it was so hot and dry in the Midwest that millions of climate refugees fled and moved to California. John Steinbeck wrote about this in The Grapes of Wrath, which was standard reading material for high school students 50 years ago. Public school students no longer read The Grapes of Wrath, but they are universally exposed to Al Gore's science fiction movie. The hottest weather in U.S. history occurred 85 years ago this week. On July 14, 1936, 10 states were over 110 degrees, and 30 states were over 100 degrees. Almost every single state got over 90 degrees. The average afternoon temperature around the United States on July 14th and July 15th, 1936 was an incredible 96 degrees. And this was the front page of the New York Times on this date in 1936. Heat deaths near 3,000. Here's another article from the New York Times during July 1931. Record heat waves of the past. One in 1896 brought death to 671 persons in New York, while 553 died here in one day in 1901. And what about the summer of 1898? Cyclones were ravaging cities all over the country, and on July 9, 1898, in Chicago, 20 died, 2 driven insane, and 60 prostrated by intense heat. Many like cases throughout Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri. Much damage done by a tornado that same day in western Kentucky and southern Illinois. Right after Valentine's Day that year was one of the largest forest fires in U.S. history. 3 million acres in South Carolina burned in just 2 days. That's more burn acreage than is burned in the United States this entire year. And in September 1898 came the largest forest fires in Colorado history. The New York Times reported that the fires covered most of the northwest part of the state and people were fleeing for their lives. Michael Mann is either completely incompetent or he is a total fraud, but the press knows he will give them the misinformation which they want to tell their viewers. No states have broken their all-time temperature record this year, but in 1936, more than 20 states did. This graph is from the National Climate Assessment, and it shows that heat waves were much worse in the United States prior to 1960. It's unfortunate that so few climate scientists seem to understand anything about climate. Especially since 90 years ago they did understand that the sun controls the Earth's climate. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.